I realized when I woke up this morning that today I am officially 2 weeks out from my second Pfizer COVID vaccine, which means I am officially fully vaccinated, which I feel very excited about that. Understanding that doesn't mean I won't get sick. But if I'm exposed to COVID, my body has more preparation to fight it off so that I won't go to the hospital and hopefully won't die. So that's feels like a big relief in a year of fear, and that I'm guessing many of us have been holding. So knowing that not all of us have access to that yet. So wishing that for all of us soon. My partner is also vaccinated and asked me this morning, are we going to do something wild to mark this occasion? And I looked at my calendar and I'm like, my day looks pretty much the same as it has for the last year, which is a lot of Zoom meetings. And maybe if I'm lucky, I'll get time in the backyard to enjoy the sun, which did not happen. And it just got me thinking a little bit about like what it means to start transitioning cultures of safety practices, and thinking particularly in talking with Alphabet Sangha tonight about how queers have a particular history of learning to survive pandemic, and how to create cultures that value and celebrate safety practices. And of course, I'm talking about HIV/AIDS and the culture of safer sex practices that really helped some of us survive. And I don't know about you, but I'm definitely feeling how the surge in vaccinations is kind of breaking up and changing some of the cultural norms around me. So it felt like for a lot of the last year, I'd gotten into a bit of a cultural routine that I knew, like, here's the masks to wear, here's where the protocol about where it's safe to go, who it's safe to see in person, how I'm washing my hands, like the protocols felt clear. And over the last few weeks, all of a sudden, protocols are changing. And it's time to kind of come up with some new agreements about what is safety and how we do safety together as a community. And I know as friends are getting vaccinated, I feel both excited and very anxious about renegotiating the boundaries about what keeps us safe as a community. There's a lot of information coming at us, and what information do I trust? And I also am noticing internally, like I have a lot of impulse to change up the boundaries about how we're doing things, but I don't really trust my internal desire to shift boundaries. Like, is it a reasonable one, or am I just exhausted after a year of COVID? So I both feel my enthusiasm at connecting with more beloved people and my overwhelm, because I really want to take care here not to cause unintended harm to myself or beloved people or to the broader community. And I don't feel like I fully know yet what actions and inactions would be considered safer by my community, by cultural standards. So I felt curious, like, how does Buddhism support us in these kinds of questions? And as I thought about it, I felt curious about that. The practice that came to mind is the Buddhist practice of renunciation. And I kind of laugh at myself anytime I want to teach about renunciation, because I'll be honest, when I first heard about renunciation in Buddhist context, I hated it. I was like, this sucks. Most spaces where I've been, where renunciation gets taught, I feel like I'm supposed to abandon my body that I've worked really hard to get in contact with. Often teachers like to use examples about giving up food. And then there's an overlay of fat shaming that's very direct, which I'm like, no, thank you. Or there's a big value of trying to control food so that you can theoretically control the size and shape of your body, which I've really learned to resist for myself, of really resisting diet culture. But part of what I like to teach about renunciation is because in my own study, I've come to understand that the Buddha is not talking about dieting when he's talking about renunciation, and he's not talking about fat hatred, and he's not talking about abandoning our body. So what is he talking about, and how might it help us continue to develop safer cultural practices in our lives around COVID? So I'm talking through this example of safety practices in COVID, but and I'm going to speak through my own experience, but I'm hoping I've left this talk open enough to apply to whatever your internal questions are as well about cultural practices of safety, whether you're thinking about COVID or thinking about other things, where you really are curious about renunciation and letting go. So what does renunciation look like in Buddhism? So one thing is that the definitions of renunciation can actually look different depending on the lineage you're related to. And I think that David Chapman has this blog called Vividness, and he has an article on renunciation in Buddhism, which I feel like lays this out really nicely. And I'll speak specifically about two aspects of it. And he talks about it as the traditionalists and a modern revision. And so the traditionalists talk about renunciation of sense pleasure as being really at the heart of Buddhist practice. We think about the monastic renunciation of sex as being something that feels really core to how Buddhist practice happens. Or living without personal possessions, only having the robes you're wearing, not using money, and that it's a real engine that can build up our energy toward freedom. So that's one way to think about renunciation. And then there's the second way to think about renunciation, which is a more modern revision, in which meditation practice is put at the center. And it's less about abandoning the pleasures and more about abandoning your attachment to the sense pleasures. Does that make sense? So I don't necessarily have to abandon all sex, for instance, because I'm not a monastic, but I want to be careful to not feel so attached to sex that I sort of have to have a connection to that to feel safe, happy, alive in this world. That's the edge that I'm trying to watch out for. A couple of quotes on that from teachers. Suzuki Roshi says, renunciation is not giving up the things of this world, but accepting that they go away. So this is part of recognizing the impermanence of this world. And Pema Chodron says, what one is renouncing is closing down and shutting off from life. You could say that renunciation is the same thing as opening to the teachings of the present moment. So that's really about connecting to our aliveness. So there's these two choices of how Buddhists think about it. And for me, it's not about choosing which of these lineages is the correct one, but I actually find both of them helpful to steer me in the right direction at different times. And it's actually one of my favorite stories in Buddhism is this story from Ajahn Chah, who's a teacher of the Thai forest lineage. And he had a student who got really, really angry at him and was like, Ajahn Chah, yesterday you told one student one thing, and then today you told another student the complete opposite thing. Which is it? You need to get it right. And Ajahn Chah turned to the student and was like, what I'm trying to instruct people on is finding what, like finding their way down a road, finding their way down a middle path. And so if I see a student about to go into the ditch on the right, I'm going to tell that student to go left. And then the next day, if I see the student going into the ditch on the left, I'm going to tell that student to go right. Those look like opposite instructions, but they're directing students on the same path. So this is for me like like something that's been helpful for me when I hear the complexity of Buddhist thought, some of which can feel related or at odds with each other. I remember, does this go left and go right? And when will this be useful for me? I also really like this teaching from Ajahn Amaro on renunciation. And he says, in English, the word renunciation has the connotation of gritting one's teeth and bearing a diminished situation for some sort of spiritual good. It's going without something that you really would prefer to have. But within Buddhist practice, the quality of renunciation, or nekkhamma as it's called in Buddhi, or called in Pali, doesn't have that sense of diminution. It has a whole different tone. The word brahmacharya, which can be used as a synonym for the renunciate life and also for celibacy, literally means divine conduct or walking with the gods. So rather than going without, one is actually choosing to walk with the divine instead of being caught up in ordinary worldly preoccupation. So what does this reflection on renunciation give us in this current daily practice of finding some cultural practices about staying safer amidst COVID? So for me in particular, whenever I feel like there's only one way to do things, renunciation is a tool I pull out to really help me open up my choices and get mindful about where I'm stuck. And earlier I mentioned that I'm feeling a little unclear about my desire to shift my boundaries. Seeing that I am really excited to change my practices and getting to see people, but I'm like, do I trust myself? Like, what is the impulse behind this? Because there's like some part of me, if I'm honest, that's just like ready to throw a big party, invite everybody I know, make out with everybody. Like, I'm just like, let's just do it all. And so I'm like, okay. Even if we like put masks on for all of that, that's probably not the best idea. So I know that I have some level of impulse that I know is like doesn't lead to safety. So what happens if I slow down this impulse with the practice of renunciation? And maybe not that level of example, but because realistically, I don't actually know how to host a party anymore. I've forgotten most of those social skills. So even just like inviting 2 friends over for dinner inside though feels like a big deal right now. So I feel like these 2 paths, like one is abandoning attachment to sense pleasures. Now, this is one side of the path. And the second is actually giving up the sense pleasures themselves, but with this intent to walk with the gods. I like that language there. This intent to, really find ourselves in some kind of divine conduct that's beyond our own needs. So I'm exploring on both of those paths to get curious. So if I'm abandoning attachment to these sense pleasures, so I know I'm really excited about the possibility of inviting my friends over. But what is it like to envision for myself that maybe we'll decide it's not safe enough to hug each other? How do I feel about that? Or we've talked about serving food together, but maybe we'll decide that it's not actually safe enough to share food. Do I get anxious? Do I feel okay about those choices? Does that feel like a choice I can make? Or do I feel like there's only one option available for me? What if we decide we need to meet outside, or actually just postpone meeting up altogether until community conditions feel safer? I feel like part of what we're trying to explore and find out is what are the feelings and needs that come up in me that I can be taking better care of, regardless of whether this dinner will happen. Because those needs are here, and I can be taking care of those with the dinner or without the dinner. And that's part of what we're trying to understand. And like an example of that, for instance, if I'm not feeding myself the most top-notch food because I haven't had my friends over for dinner for a year, maybe that's something I could do for myself, regardless of whether the potluck happens or not. So if I was like, but I was gonna make the beef short ribs, like maybe I make that anyway, so that I can eat them. And enjoy that and actually get to savor that if that's part of what's important here. So the second possibility of renunciation, if I'm actually giving up some sense of sense pleasure to walk with the gods or for some divine choice. Just noticing that I'm really anxious to see and love on my friends, but like 5 years from now, looking back, like how much of an impact will it really be if we end up waiting another few weeks on this while more people get vaccinated? Like what happens if I can see myself in the larger tapestry of community? And even though I'm vaccinated, like it's still possible that I could be a vector that spreads the virus. And that matters when a lot of people are still sick and a lot of people are still unprotected. And maybe that means I should be like thinking more carefully about sticking to some smaller pods for a bit, or having a phase of that before I open to a wider network of people. And I'm saying all this like not to determine for us what the cultural practices should be, because I definitely do not know and still am determining for myself. But just to like talk through for myself and with you, like how leaning into renunciation practice, this practice of considering saying no to my desires, actually gives me more space to thoroughly caring choices about what I want to do, and choices that impact both me and my community. And if I have choice, I then feel less likely to just be swept up by the winds of my individual emotions. And I think this is how we actually can build a community of care and the kinds of cultures that care about each other's safety. And this, I think, is what renunciation really supports me with. And Gil Fronsdal likes to say, renunciation should bring joy, or at least a lightness of being. So I wonder, looking at the time, instead of breakout rooms, I wonder if we can just do a little bit of just personal reflection on this question for yourself, where you might consider an example in your own life where you're really focused on like honing in, like you're honed in on one right way to do things. It might be in COVID safety, it might be in something completely different, where like I'm really excited about this way of doing things or changing habits. And just thinking about how renunciation as a practice, as an exploration, might support you. And I'll just put these two things to consider, just taking 3 or 4 minutes here. If you're abandoning attachment to sense pleasures in this, or if you're giving up sense pleasure to walk with the gods. So if you want to write about it or just sit in contemplation, whatever you would find helpful here, to just apply this to something in your own experience.